Welcome to Dr. Deep State. It's Friday night and we are live. We have a special guest tonight from Tampa Bay, Florida, named Grant. But before I introduce him and say howdy to our friend Aaron, who is in the house, I wanted to take a minute and say thank you so much to all of our Tampa guests that we've had. Tim, Carolina, Casey, you were great. Um, uh,
Michael.
Raphael, and it's just been fantastic having all of you share your sense of community that you have with the rest of the world. And that's what we're trying to do over on Locals. Whatever happens to the traditional Latin Mass, it'll never be crushed. And certainly the spirit of it will never be crushed. And that's what we're about doing, especially over on Locals, is keeping that spirit alive. And first or foremost, finding and pivoting into the very treasure that we have, and then sharing it with each other and spreading it throughout the world. Greetings from beautiful Northern Australia. Hello, Snowy. Nice to have you with us. Aaron, please introduce your guest tonight. And I think the title is The Modern World and Its Contradictions. And it's going to be heady, but Grant is giving me the background. It's going to be totally cool. So please, Aaron, introduce our guest for the evening.
Grant is our reluctant captive tonight. I've been talking to him for a while, trying to get him to come on. Grant is graduated college, smart guy, finished law school, finished the bar, and then decided he was going to go off to Focus Ministry, which is a Catholic college ministry. He did that in Louisiana, down in the New Orleans area, and which was very surprising because he's also a convert. So his conversion was so severe that that he's like, no, I got to go out and spread this. So foregoing fame and fortune, he went off to a life of poverty in New Orleans, and phenomenal stories from there. A great thinker, a great researcher, a very great writer. He's part of our group as well down here of truth seekers that are trying to get to the bottom of everything and understand how it all works and how it all ties together. So every opportunity I get to speak with Grant, it's always edifying. And also recently married, beautiful wife, and very fortunate both of them to find each other. So I'm excited about Grant's talk tonight. So without further ado, Grant, thanks for coming on finally.
And Grant, you can be as comfortable if you want. I'll let you go with any part of the backstory. And Grant.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Dr. Haugen, for having me on. I greatly admire the work that you and Will Tucker have done, and I've taken so much away from what I've seen from both of you, from Theo Howard at Fonde Radio, and from a number of the guests that both of you have had on your shows. And Aaron used the word reluctant in me coming on, and it's kind of tongue in cheek because I did want to come on when given the opportunity, but part of the experience that I've had and part of what I want to speak to is recognizing our limitations as human beings. And I think to that end, there's a verse from the Book of Wisdom that I'd like to start with. And it's from the 6th chapter of the Book of Wisdom, verses, I think, 2 to 12. And it says, "Hear therefore, you kings, and understand. Learn, you that are judges of the ends of the earth. Give ear, you that rule the people, and that please yourselves in multitudes of nations. For power is given you by the Lord, and strength by the Most High, who will examine your works and search out your thoughts. Because being ministers of his kingdom, you have not judged rightly, nor kept the law of justice, nor walked according to the will of God. Horribly and speedily will he appear to you, for a most severe judgment shall be for them that bear rule. For to him that is little, mercy is granted, but the mighty shall be mightily tormented. For God will man's personally stand in awe of any man's greatness. For he made the little and the great, and he hath equally care of all. But a greater punishment is ready for the more mighty. To you, therefore, O kings, are these my words, that you may learn wisdom and not fall from it. And so I intended to reference that section of verses tonight at some point, because the access that we have to technology and resources allows pretty much all of us to spend all of our time doing this, looking into these questions that we've stumbled upon at various points in our lives. And the reality is that you could spend your entire life searching for new topics and always find more. You could expend your entire life delving into one topic and never reach its conclusion. So it's incumbent on each of us to decide to what degree we're going to invest our time in looking into this information, which is absolutely critical to look into, because we do have to understand what the truth is, but no one will temper those things for us. And we also have to recognize that we have access to platforms that allow us to speak to more people than someone else would have at any other period in history. And it's very easy to see the ability to access something and to access it without considering whether you ought to or not. And that idea really speaks to what has been in my thoughts for the past several years, especially since my conversion, a story that I'm sure that I'll get into. But that's generally the place that I'm coming from, because seeing all of these things go on the last few years, I've always wondered, what am I supposed to do in light of these things on a day-to-day basis? How am I supposed to have conversations with other people about things on a day-to-day basis without getting into an hours-long conversation about very specific, out of context facts that I've found over the course of several years that I can't contextualize to someone in a 10-minute conversation? So that's the very broad brush picture of where I'm coming into all of this, and why I don't take it lightly to not that anyone else does, but I don't take it lightly to go on and speak to people as an authority.
Yeah. I like the fact that you began with just the concept of wisdom. I think, like reality itself, has an immanent and a metaphysical dimension, and we're going to be talking about metaphysical contradictions innate within the world that we're given. It's in the air that we breathe. And how do you, like you're saying, how do you know how to identify those, how they're being manipulated? And when we speak to other people, especially when we share the gospel, how do we know to sort of know when to hold them and know when to fold them? I went back into a comment section, and I'll be frank, it can be frustrating. That's why Will helps me. When it's over at Locals, and by the way, I wanted to say this and bump in. Will was talking to me today about the Telegram on Locals. He said there's some great conversations going on over there. So he said, just get it on your Android, because I said I'm having trouble getting it. So I want to go over there, and people are talking about In Pursuit of the Metaverse. And so I'm excited to go over there. But yeah, online, some people are saying, like, why should we not vote? Aren't Catholics supposed to vote? And it's like, okay, I can't explain both my books and all my videos and everything. I don't know where to begin. I don't want to ignore you. And so that's a microcosm of just our lives, our families and everything. But what you said to me the other day, your story and what you've discovered just fascinated me. And it's very deep. And I completely agree with you with what you're saying, and please feel free to lay that out.
Sure. So a couple of words that I think are going to be important for the context of my own personal experience are words and concepts that are in your book. One being incommensurability, which is no common standard of measure, and another one is from the foreword offered by, I think it was Professor Kaczynski, talking about the ability to see caves from the allegory of the cave that you have come out of, but not being able to see the ones that you're in. And specifically recognizing the idea that having the idea in your mind that you are in a cave does not itself identify the cave. And that once you've gotten out of something and you see the falsehood for what it is, it can lead. I know that I had this experience more than once where I thought that I was just out. I was out and I was done. And then months later, pretty much on accident, most of the time, I would come across something that made me realize I was applying the same wrong principle that I'd been applying inside that first or second or third cave or whatever it was in another way. And then it's gone out from there. And the principle that I've sort of fixated on is the concept of authority and who has the authority to define terms, which we'll get into. But
Yeah.
my own personal story really begins when I began law school in the fall of 2018, and I met my best friend, and who turned out to be my best man. And we were in law school, but if you looked at our day-to-day activity, you would have thought that we were in grad school for some other discipline of philosophy or politics or something like that. Not to say that we were any good at it, but that's what we were spending our time talking about. And one of the many discussions that we had was about governance and the ability for a state to regulate morality. And at the time, I was kind of a conservatarian-y person, having some questions about it because I couldn't reconcile the idea of people uniting around not uniting around anything, with freedom and free will sort of interchanged as just doing what you want. But he said that the state should have a say in morality. And I asked him why. And he said, because we know what the right thing is. And I thought that that was interesting because I believed in objective morality, but I couldn't articulate it because it was not a part of my political platform. And a problem that we'll discuss probably later on is that we aren't these blank slate creatures supposed by someone like John Locke, but we kind of think that we are without realizing it. This is one of these things, is that we behave in accordance with software that's been programmed into our minds that we don't realize is hardware. But it's not just that we don't realize that it's hardware. We don't even realize that it's there at all. We just think that these are the ways that a person thinks. But he put this idea forward to me, and I decided that I wanted to figure out how I would argue objective morality to someone who was trying to argue against it. So there are these words, good and evil. And those are very abstract terms. So if I were to say to someone, you can choose between diet and exercise and injecting yourself with heroin, someone might say those are just different lifestyle choices. One is not better or worse than the other. And then what do you do from there? So I changed out those words, good and evil, with the words life and death. And suddenly it became very clear that there are very obvious decisions that people make every day that lead them to generate or to degenerate. And things can happen. You can be on your way to the gym and a piano falls on you and someone says, hey, look, that wasn't very generative of you to try to go to the gym. But absent these sort of random interferences, we know that there are decisions that generate and decisions that degenerate life. So I became very comfortable accepting the idea that what was good was generative to life and what was bad was degenerative to it. And if someone wanted to argue with me about that and say that death was equal or better than life, then they can go ahead and stand on the other side of me. And I'm comfortable walking away from that conversation saying, just so we're clear, you are on the side of death and I am on the side of life, but you will not say that one of those is better than the other. I'm comfortable walking away from a conversation like that. But that didn't substantiate to me the idea that the state should intervene in morality, because people get to do what they want. If someone wants to choose death, they get to choose it. If someone wants to choose life, they want to choose it. But at the same time, it occurred to me that most people, and in most cases, choose things that are bad for them, that they know are bad for them. I did not realize at the time that I was stumbling onto the idea of concupiscence and the human inclination towards sin. And that if you take two options and equate them on a level of morality or input output or whatever you have, taking the diet and exercise example, if you diet and exercise or do heroin, you will have the same physical outcome to your body. I've never done heroin, but I assume it feels pretty good if people expend all of their resources purchasing it. But you could replace that with anything else, whether it was junk food or ice cream or cigarettes or alcohol. It doesn't matter. If someone is going to get the same outcome doing something easier, they will choose the easier thing in most cases. And that's just generally what's gone on in the civilization of which we are a part, where people have complete material abundance and we are deteriorating. And a reason why that is that all of these entities have a perfect return on investment for these products and services that they offer. And all of these products and services don't do anything for a person's life, the proliferation of their physical, mental, spiritual well-being. They all offer a sensation in exchange for that person's life. And there is no force that can compete with those entities because the virtue is not profitable. And so you have at the same time what I was valuing as the ultimate good, the invisible hand of the free market, operating against private religious ideals that I believed that I held strongly, which I really didn't. Because if you have a family who spends time together, they go to mass, they do their stuff, whatever, they're not endlessly consuming resources because they don't have this hole in their heart that they need to fill apart from the one that can't be filled during this life and can only be filled by eternal life with God. But people like that aren't the best consumers. The best consumers are the people who want to buy the new thing, the yearly phone, the yearly car, the new game, the new this, the new that. And there isn't a competitor who can push back against those things, not so that people can't make their own decisions, but so that they can. Because right now, people only get exposed to ads and marketing and all these different things that tell them to do these things, and nothing that tells them otherwise, apart from the influence of perhaps their parents or a good teacher or coach. Who, my parents are about the best parents that I can think of, and their influence on me was strong enough that I was able to come out of these things at a certain point, but it just can't compete with the volume and the level that these things can reach children now through all these different avenues. So at that point, I thought about what it really meant to be free, where before freedom was the state doesn't stop me from doing something. And because that was classical liberal sense of freedom contrasted with the more progressive liberal definition of freedom, which is the state sort of stepping in to allow a person to maximize their capacity based on merit, given any sort of discrepancies they may have in their upbringing or their environment or whatever it is. So basically, if you come from a poor family, state helps you along so that you can achieve the equivalent that someone from a rich family with those resources, born into those resources, could achieve. But that difference doesn't really matter for us right now. But it's a license, its ability to just do things without interference. And what I realized was that all of these things were things that were not good for me, that I was choosing, not because they would do anything for me, but because they would tell me a lie about how they would make me, well, what they would do for me based on how they would make me feel. When in reality, all they were doing was taking my life from me. And so freedom then became to me the ability to make a decision independent of the temptations toward pleasure or away from pain. And I didn't know really at the time that that was more or less how the Catholic Church defined the word freedom. But this is 2 years before I'm even really thinking about specifically religious questions. But coming to that conclusion and seeing how wrong I was about what was fundamental truth to me, the free market. I mean, that really was my, I'm not saying it in a oh, I was doing bad idolatry. I just mean in practical terms, that was my idol. That was the thing that I would not question. And when I realized that it was wrong, I thought I could be wrong about anything else, anything. This is about as foundational a thing as I could be wrong about. You could tell me that this floor in front of me is really just a black hole, and if I step over that direction, I'm going to fall into it. That is how paralyzed I was. But I also became detached from the things that I believed to be true, because another factor that plays into this is that telling someone the truth about basic reality isn't as simple as telling someone that 2 + 2 is 4. 2 + 2 is 4 is an impersonal mathematical equation. And telling someone this is the reality of the metaphysical underwriter of everything about your existence that dictates the terms of what your eternal life will be or will not be. And if you are born into a tradition and you're born believing these things that authority figures that you trust have told you, and you've based your entire life on coming to these, or not coming to these conclusions, but acting on these conclusions, that is a very difficult thing for a person to question. And so what occurred for me in seeing that I was wrong about that one thing is that every question to me stopped being like a personal judgment on what I believed. And it all just became math. I just wanted to have the truth. I wanted to be in the truth. And that sort of spilled out into this 2-ish year long exploration of all these different things with my close friends, and one of whom was raised Catholic but didn't believe in God. And we had a bunch of conversations about that, where I basically said, look, either all of this came from something or all of it came from nothing. And I know that the first one sounds crazy, but the second one sounds even crazier. So he starts going back to Mass and tells me that I ought to as well. And I said, I don't have to go to Mass because I am a Protestant. And he said, well, you should, because it's the true one. It's the correct one. And I said, on what basis do you believe that it's the correct one? And he showed me the verse from the book of Matthew on Peter receiving the keys and being the rock. And I read that passage of scripture with no care about what it meant. And when I read it, I just thought, oh, he's just in charge. He's just the guy who's in charge. So I guess he's the Pope, and I guess I need to be Catholic. And that's actually skipping a little over ahead, the thought that I had that in terms of truth, I believed in theism and I believed in Christianity, but there are all these different definitions of what Christianity is. And according to the laws of identity and non-contradiction, you can't have two things saying the same thing or saying different things about the same thing that contradict each other and have those things be true in the same sense and at the same time. So for all these different definitions of Christianity, either, you could have, it's just believe in Jesus, and that's what true Christianity is. Okay, that still makes every other theory wrong. Even if they're sufficient, they have a bunch of components that are not necessary for salvation. And so one of these definitions has to be right, or none of them are right. And the real Christianity is just this ethereal idea that no one has ever discovered, that has all these different concepts. But the Eucharist can't be Jesus and not be Jesus. Baptism can't save you and not save you. Those questions have answers. And so the Catholic Church is true, and I will say that all day and all night. But speaking to this idea of getting into the mind of different people and where they are, it's just pointing out things that don't prompt them to go to dig their heels in. Because right now, the worst thing that you can do to someone is tell them that something that they believe is wrong. Because everyone thinks that they have a license to define what the truth is for themselves. And if you say that they're wrong about something, their immediate response is, no, I'm right. And that's, I think, a magical thing about asking questions, is that it isn't necessarily overtly confrontational, and it can prompt someone to introspect and answer a question in a way that allows them to save face. Because again, if what we're trying to do here is save souls, you want to find the avenue that you can go through to get to someone. And all of these experiences for me were asking myself questions that got me to answers that I had to acknowledge once they were put in front of my face. I think you're muted, Dr. Haugen.
Yeah, I was going to say, I want you to keep going. So one of the ideas, there's so many there. I want you to keep going. Yeah, just life and death. And Scripture's so clear that, well, let's just say the church is clear. Natural law is our road to divine law, and that is eternal life. And everything that's different from that. And Christ said that we can really think of things in dichotomies, in this sense that either you are for me or you are against me. And I think, that kind of clear thinking, and Aristotle confirmed that with his law of non-contradiction. But so many things you're saying are hitting me, but especially, if we're spreading the word or we're just engaging in the world, people do dig in their heels when you kind of approach them that way. But it's two sets of pride always battling each other. And when we kind of take that classical Socratic kind of method toward investigating reality, you're getting people to kind of feel them toward reality. But I think we are right when we do believe that reality is objective, and that should be our starting point. And I'm going to let you continue, Grant. This is great.
I want to make 2 points, if you don't mind. Because we actually talked about this last night in Men's Holy League, because you have a lot of Protestants out there today. They're talking, when you bring up the real presence, they're like, yeah, absolutely, we believe that John 6 is true, and it's the act of the faithful who consubstantiate or transubstantiate. They don't have a really developed theology with regards to what actually happens to the cracker and grape juice that is sitting in front of them. But they believe, as many Catholics do today, that it's their faith that's part of the hope. So what I find is that when I'm having conversations with Protestants, and I'll bring this up, I'll say either there is an objective truth, one true church, one true religion, one road to salvation, or when you get to heaven, God doesn't really care about what you wound up believing as long as you did it in good conscience and it came from a good place, which is no different than saying, as long as I'm a good person, God's going to let me in. And I think a lot of that comes back to what you were talking about earlier, Grant, when it says, people are making decisions based on the acquisition of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And we live in a world right now that that has so much available to us that there is no, like I encounter it every day. I'm conscious of it more and more whenever I go into my refrigerator and I've got something that I want that's just sitting there. So we don't encounter suffering forced upon us, especially in the U.S. We can kind of see it coming. But I would imagine whenever you go to places like the Ukraine, or you go to places like Palestine, where these guys are suffering, they're holding fast to their faith. There's no such thing as objective morality whenever you get into real suffering. That doesn't mean that you find God in the foxholes, because proof positive that that's one of the places that despair sets in and they lose all hope. But I think that there's an element right now going on in the world when you're talking to someone where you have to kind of decide quick and in a hurry, like that guy that says death is equally good to life. You've got to decide that's not someone that I need to talk to, because they're not engaged in any sort of logical thinking. So I need to move on. But when you do find that one person, it's a very difficult road getting them to question just basic philosophical, basic truth claims that they have, because subjectivity has so invaded our thought process that we very seamlessly and without noticing it go from one contradiction to another in order to justify a particular position that we hold.
Yeah, and before Grant comes in, you beautifully described the idea of the simulacrum, which is we're designed to be connected to God, but the modern consumer society has put us in this glass house of mirrors. So everything that's meant for that concept, we substitute it for something cardinal. And what we're trying to get to is how to return to the fullness of what we were intended to be. And the Catholic Church is the answer, because it had at one time a holistic system where the politics, the economy, and everything was perfectly tuned. And as we've come away from it, the ultimate goal, we're assuming some people are pushing us in this direction, is for pure simulacrum, so that we wouldn't even have the ability to have this conversation anymore, because that thread back to reality, that which is historical, that which is hierarchical, that which is sacramental, would be destroyed. So, and you laid it out perfectly, Grant, so I'm going to let you get back to your story.
Sure. And that point about walking away from a conversation in the way that pertains to simulacrum and the spectacle is the danger that a person gets into when they try to have conversations with someone on terms other than true ones. Because one of the things that we're going to talk about is when you have a conversation with someone downstream from a truth that they have rejected or that they are not entertaining, you've conceded it. And that's where some of these things are so difficult to find, is that the dogma of the statement is not in the statement, it's prior to the statement.
Yes.
A great example is there's a guy named I don't know how to pronounce French names, but it's Frederick Bastiat or something. He wrote a book called The Law After the French Revolution. And he's basically talking about classical liberalism. And I read this book when I was in college, and I'm like, wow, this guy is great. This is totally nailing everything. And I went back and looked at it a couple of months ago. And one of the statements that was in this book was, the law exists for the protection of property rights. And I just went forward with that definition being operative without asking the question, is this person authorized to say what the law is for? And if he's not, then who is? But if I'm entertaining his ideas, not questioning the premise that informs them, then I'm being deceived without realizing that I'm being deceived. And that is only happening because I'm venturing into these ideas in the first place. And that's one thing that I think is of critical importance, perhaps not for your audience, because I think if anyone has found this channel, they probably know a little bit more than the average bear. But people don't decide whether they should go into a subject or not. They just go into it and think that they have the prerequisite capacity to understand what it is they're looking into. And one other point before I continue on with the story, from what Aaron said about war. First of all, I've never been in the military. I've never been in a war, so I can't speak from personal experience. But Ernst Junger in Storm of Steel, and another guy whose name I can't pronounce, which I think it's René Guénon or something. They speak to this idea of the reign of quantity and the signs of the times, where when material considerations supersede the metaphysical, which is the age that we live in, where all that counts is material. That's why one reason why prayer is so devalued, because there's no transactional obvious return on it. And so people think, oh, I just sat there and did nothing. So why would I do that when I could be working for another half hour doing something else for however long? Anyway, warfare in a material conception of reality it's industrial. It's just, we're going to throw people at the enemy until they run out of people or we run out of people. And it is inhuman. It's not a human way of conducting warfare. And so it's no surprise to me if people lose their faith in environments like that, because they're conducting war on a materialistic premise. And so if you guys have any responses to that, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I can.
Something I heard, I'm going to respond to it in a video this week, but everybody's confused about, does Pope Francis have the authority to disband the TLM? And I'm going to kind of use it speaking to your idea of what suppositions we have when we're going into a conversation. And liberalism, a lot of us have had this epiphany, and I had a guest on yesterday and we discussed this, kind of getting out of the cave of classical liberalism is very difficult, because even the Catholic Church has by and large embraced it in the 20th century, but we have to do better. And so we've become sort of inculcated into these man-made constitutions. But the Catholic Church, what has always been true, the magisterium, points us to a divine constitution. And so when we apprehend the fullness of reality, we got to move back, that there's something that trumps all of these kind of modern republics with their supposed checks and balances and so forth, that we've been sort of trained to just assume, well, that problem solved, and not to see that this is the work of men. And I'll let you keep going.
And yeah, that's absolutely true. And for a reference point for anyone who's thinking about this idea of life and death, this is a shorter selection of verses, but this is from the first chapter of the book of Wisdom, verses 12 to 16. Seek not death in the error of your life, neither procure your destruction by the works of your hands. For God made not death, neither hath he pleasure in the destruction of the living. For he created all things that they might be, and he made the nations of the earth for health. And there is no poison of destruction in them, nor kingdom of hell upon the earth. For justice is perpetual and immortal. But the wicked with works and words have called it to them, and esteeming it a friend have fallen away, and have made a covenant with it, because they are worthy to be of the part thereof. And that is a very concrete example to me of a reference point that we all have to go back to. And what I mean by that is, I don't expect everybody to eat the perfectly correct food all the time, to never have any junk food, to never drink beer, whatever. But you can look at pretty much everything you do on a scale of, is this the most life-giving thing? The receiving the Eucharist, the highest thing that you can do during your earthly life. On the other end of the spectrum, do some very obvious, horrible, grave sin, whichever one that you think of. And then there's a bunch of stuff somewhere in between. And you can assess things to see even if they're just a little bit good for your life or a little bit bad for your life, and stack decisions together that are giving of life and not taking away from it. Because every time you do that, you are answering the question, yes, I want to live. Because all of this entire life it's just an answer to that question. Do I want to live? and saying that I'm willing to suffer discomfort and go without for this very brief period of time that I'm here for the sake of a greater future reward. It really has a lot to do with time preference and instant gratification. There's a great book on that idea, also from a kind of anarcho-capitalist guy named Hans Hermann Hoppe, makes a much better argument for monarchy, but that's beside the point. But anyway, that is a reference point for just normal decision making outside of, am I going to mass enough? Am I going to confession enough? Those are important questions, but all of the things that we come into contact with throughout our daily life are circumstances that God, at the very least, is permitting us to experience. So he's speaking to us through everything that we do, and everything that we do in response to something to which we are exposed is an answer to him. And that's a really hard thing to think about from moment to moment, but through a continual willingness to persevere in prayer, to receive the sacraments, they change your mind. These things, ascetic practices and all these things, they're not just good penitential things to do to show God that you'll go without them. They change the way that you think. I mean, exercise for me was an extremely important one, where I was doing an activity that was painful and repetitive. And over the course of time, it enhanced my capacity to do something. And these questions about freedom and life and all these things, they're born out in the things that you do. So a big draw for Christianity to me, once I was entering back into the religious question, was the differentiation between virtue and vice. Where before I just thought God like covered his eyes and he went, all right, here's the good stuff and here's the bad stuff. But that's not what those things are at all. If you play out choices associated with virtue and vice, you will see that virtue enhances your freedom and vice diminishes it. So this is a way that liberalism comes into play. And I'm going to get into the history of these things, because the modern world and of metaphysical contradiction, these things pertain to history. But with the way that people view things now, free will and freedom are almost interchangeable. Freedom is basically maximizing the opportunities for a person to exercise free will. But freedom really is a capacity that can be filled and it can be diminished. And freedom is that, I don't know if I use that word or not, but that's what freedom is, basically. Free will is the existence of the choice, and that a person makes it. But there is no such thing as freedom in the freedom of unrestriction in choosing things. You are always subject to the thing that you are choosing, because it is convincing you to choose it in some way. So I'm going back to heroin again. If someone uses heroin for 10 years, if they survive that long, and they try to not use it on year 11, day 1, that heroin is going, no, you're not getting off this ride. You're going to continue to use me. Because even though the person is using their free will to pick up the needle and stick it in their arm, they've lost their freedom because they surrendered it to this thing that is taking from them. And it takes from them more the more they use it. That's why Jesus says, he who sins, or maybe it's in an epistle, I don't remember, but he who sins is a slave to sin. That's what that means. Because the thing that you are doing draws you into it, because it feels like it gives you something. When you tell lies and you're constrained by the stories that you've made up in order for people not to uncover the lie. You think you've gotten away with something very easily by telling a lie, but now you have to remember it. And now you have to keep referencing it, because otherwise you lost.
Yeah, they have a mimetic power. So the definition of sin, just by secular definition, is like we lose our ability to properly calculate costs and benefits, and they're miscalculated. But what the image does is kind of part of these addictions, because we live in a simulacrum. We're addicted to image, not the image of or the spectacle of Christ crucified that is the avenue to the eternal. But these images, as Baudrillard would say, have a metaphysical orbit of themselves. And so when we become addicted to the social media, the Netflix, the aspirational images of life that we have from our cardinal world, they replace the true metaphysics and give you an artificial metaphysics, but they do have a mimetic power. And I think it's important. And St. Thomas would say, they're sometimes embracing our habits, and they have their own demonic ontology to them too. But in order to detach those, we have to separate ourselves from them and identify them, because for the most part in our modern, even Christian world, we have kind of a laissez-faire attitude. And that's what you're talking about. We're kind of given laissez-faire, since you do your thing, I'll do mine. And you're saying there's something deeper that's been lost within our Catholic tradition. And that's what you're trying to get back to.
Indeed. And that the recognition of the way that those ideas play out in the decisions that we make mean that we can recognize them in ourselves, and we can know that other people can recognize them in themselves, whether they admit it to us or not, when we talk about things like that. So for a counterexample in the sense of virtue, in exercise, you can go to the gym for 10 years. And on year 11, day 1, the gym is not going to give you physical withdrawals from not going, but it is an activity that is generative, provided you're doing it in the right way. That taps into your ability to exercise your intellect and your will in knowing that it is good by having done something good for you and having a good effect, and has enhanced your ability to choose it. And for what you're describing with the simulacrum, we're enmeshed in a series of departures from truth that are all then departures from the preceding departure. And one of the ones that you're talking about, the laissez-faire attitude about you do your things, I'll do mine, but then objecting to the latest way that people depart from reality, where everyone individually of each generation exercises their own private judgment to say which truths we must conform to, instead of saying we must conform to them all, or we don't need to conform to any of them. And it's essentially the operation of the will to power in determining which ones will operate. And people don't realize that, because when people think about the will to power, they're thinking about, oh yeah, it's this big, strong person who's going to say, yeah, we're doing this. When in reality, that's not how it works out. It's people lied to your grandparents or their grandparents 80 or 100 years ago, and you're raised on things you didn't even know were questionable, and you never even had the chance to compete with the lies that are propagated to you by the people who get to dictate these questions, and you don't wonder whether you should go along with them or not. And so that's kind of I think the other component of this idea where I got to, which was on kind of the political social media scene. What happened in 2018, 2019, when people started losing faith in Trump, was this explosion of micro ideologies. It was like everyone was coming out with a new word, and I couldn't even keep up with all the names that were for them. But I wasn't doing like a libertarian, classical liberal thing like that. But I was talking about ideology. I was very into it. And when I saw all these different ideologies, I thought all these people are taking in these atomized 8-9 hours a day researching whatever it is that they're looking at, which is probably different than what I'm looking at, and coming up with these ideas about what reality really is. Well, all of them can't be right, and I assume that none of them are right, but why should I assume that I am right about the ideology that I subscribe to? And it isn't that ideologies don't contain true ideas. They do. Some of them do. They have good ideas. But there are some people from the early 20th century who make an excellent point that the problem with ideology is that it relies on this Enlightenment principle that human reason, the primacy of human reason, can answer these questions for us. And religion is baked into ideology because it relies on a conception of what a human being is and what it can do and how it operates in the world. And we're going to bundle together these ideas, and this explains exactly who we are, exactly how we operate, and society is going to, it's now going to work out. We're gonna solve the problem. It's the 1,000 years. It's millennialism. It's that concept, and none of them take into account the reality of sin. None of them take into reality the idea of concupiscence. And this is the usurpation of reality, where people are saying,
Yes.
we get to decide
Yes.
what these things are.
Yes. Well, usurpation, we cut the cat off the king, there's a vacuum. And that's what you're talking about, all the explosion of different things. And that is exactly what will to power wants, because it takes advantage of that and advances its agenda at those punctuated moments.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a new ideology is transferred at those moments. And I think we're getting set up for one of those moments right now, ritualistically, but that's a side topic. I love what you're saying. So true. Yes. Modernity has a false anthropology of man.
Yeah, it has. And that is getting increasingly atomized with an issue like transgenderism, which I think is the penultimate expression of self-will, one away from literal suicide, which is kind of on the back end of the historical timeline of these things. But speaking of the application of seeing how you're in something, or the principle that a person can use to navigate these waters, one of them is posing the question to yourself of, to what ideas do I subscribe to that arise from a rebellion against authority? And is that authority legitimate? And why do people think the way they think now? Where postmodernists, they just don't think that there's any truth, but their criticism of modernism, and so postmodern, that's like anyone who's basically saying, this is an institution of oppression, and it is designed to take the will of the strong and enact it against the oppressed classes. That's what that idea pretty much is. And the problem is that their criticism is correct, because for countries who go, we don't want to follow our king anymore, so we're just going to kill the king and then make our own rules based on reason. And then people downstream from them go, well, you didn't like your authority and you wanted to make your own rules on the basis of reason, whatever you mean by that. So why can I not do the same thing to you? And someone may think that their reason or their justification for what it is they're doing is wrong, but it's the same principle. It's an act.
You hit it. I mean, that's the mind virus that was modernity. And I can quickly say, because I think you're going to get back to the nation state system, which had to be built in order to build the new world order system. So it had to be yanked from the fullness of the context of the integral subsidiarity, that the wholeness of what was Catholic Church. So it came further into the simulacrum. But there's principles that could be triggered because, first of all, they had to atomize everything in order to build it back up into the New World system. So that's where we get nationalism and all that mimetic drama that goes with it. And so, you know, you have the whole romanticism and kind of making it the be all and end all. First of all, the Renaissance made humans the be all and end all and replacement of God. And then the nation is, because you get that collective, but it's all, nobody sees in the long term that it was a plan to get us to crack the egg and then to bring us back into this new world order. And then what was really explosive, was 1776 and this idea that of self-determination. So that would spread. Whether it's good or bad, but it would spread. You can go on and on. It goes down to Haiti. But I usually focus on, for example, Mexico, 1821, which copies the same idea. Here, we want to have a divorce and be self-sufficient. And it seems great. And then within a few years, Nicaragua wants their own, Costa Rica wants their own, Texas wants their own, and it's just scrambling. And then to add it on, now, when Woodrow Wilson comes in the picture, of course, he's got a handler, Colonel Hall. These guys are always colonels. And he's going to introduce in this confusing moment when mass machinery has slaughtered the world in World War I. Now you're going to come up with some crazy plot like a League of Nations, and you're going to interject some idea called self-determination. And it sounds so beautiful that, we're Czechs and we're Slavs and we're Serbs. And it's just a formula for infinite violence that's going to be capitalized on by the military industrial complex and their cronies. So the commanding heights of the economy would have to infinite. And so in the meantime, seemingly you're embracing your ancient culture, but it's actually being ripped from you because it's going to be torn by the time that we're going to pull it apart. And then we're going to open the borders and then stir it all back up. These people do really plan in centuries. And so the best part, so it's that mimetic tension of self-actualization. And that's always the problem when we go through a concrete reality that's sacramental, both heaven and earth, transcendent and immanent. And then you're sliced from that. And that connection to Christ the King and the wholeness of the system is put on you and your imagination of what you could be. And then you have your choice of identity. Do I want to be male, female, bi, us, them? Do I want to be, and what do you want to emphasize most in order to achieve your aspirations? So we're like consumers with our own identity, and we're getting so far away from Christ the King as it's intended to be, with all authority and power coming from above, and into ourselves, just locked into a consumerism of our very identity when we're given the choice. And we have no perspective, and we have no idea of reality or objective standards for this. And all we have is nihilism by design. And so, according to Albert Pike, that was the plan. First, we're going to create nihilists, and then you crack the eggs, and then we're going to scoop them up, and we're going to make the omelet, which is the new messianic age. And then we're going to decide who goes on the threshing room floor and who's going to be material to be our workmen in the new system. Sorry, Grant, I got so carried away.
No, that was great. And it's fun. It's not funny, but it is funny that all of these liberations, as you're describing, they don't even have to do with the liberation itself, exactly like what you're saying. It is for a completely different purpose. And one of them is, or a way of describing it is that the more foundational you can make a person question, the more foundational questions you can introduce to a person about their own existence and forcing choices upon them, the easier they are to manipulate. And so with something like transgenderism, before, any time in human history, a person grows up, you're a boy, you're a girl, and you make decisions and you go do your life. And now children, they are so unable to comprehend reality because they're presented with what they think is this monumental choice or potential choice of what they even are. And so the space in their mind is just occupied by this meaningless, it's a non-question. It shouldn't even be in the person's mind. And it doesn't matter what they think about it. It matters that they're thinking about it. And the same thing occurs with people who, if a person is not grappling with that issue, they're some 20-year-old, 21-year-old guy who's scrolling through TikTok videos for 5 hours a day minimum or something like that. And again, it's not about, I mean, they are seeing some pretty bad stuff that's shaping their minds inside of the time expenditure. but they're just distracted. They're just taken out. They've taken themselves out of the game for the novelty of seeing a new image. And
exactly.
and
They're
that
lost in their anthropology.
exactly what you're saying.
I mentioned this. I want to get, have Aaron get a chance to jump in here too, before we continue on. I said this in my conversation yesterday with the Catholic Esquire. I was always looking for an identity because I just thought that's what it is. This is laissez-faire, and you got one chance and you make the most of the materials given. And I was the authority of my own life. I was my own pope. And I probably took somewhat when I kind of had my conversion of this kind of forensic justification. So I get to decide kind of what sin based on what, and something that returned to me, and now I'll pick up a pattern where it really clicked with my identity. And it was a return to the understanding of the totality of Christendom. And I got that from reading Archbishop Lefebvre. And it just hit me that it's not just all competing ideologies. There was a perfected order, because it was an order in which men resigned themselves to the eternal law and to an eternal divine constitution. And so once I read that, I just realized there is a standard, and it wasn't just I have an identity in Christ, but it was a stable constitution that I could be drawn into that metaphysical orbit and that reality. And then from that authority on high, not sovereignty in the people, but from on high, I could then be lifted up to this. And it was the most amazing, it's been the most amazing transcendent experience. And I am going to continue with other mostly mid-century priests who have been memory holed. And I'll tell you what they all have in common with Archbishop Lefebvre here and Father Fahey is they all recognize the role of the synagogue. And that's why I keep hitting it. To us truly to return there, just knowing that it's lizards or Lentians is going to keep you going like this with the mimetic energy. It starts to come back to the true metaphysical orbit of Christ the King and understanding and being drawn from that authority that comes on high uniquely. And we have to detach, at least for now, from this lie of the serpent that authority comes from below. I want to go up to Aaron to kind of chime in. Before I do, if you want to kind of click in on this. So I had some comments this week. Protestants sometimes watch it. Doesn't look like this evening, but they'll come back and probably play it. I still have some in my audience, and I think I can maybe say things that are kind of alienating because maybe my style as a convert, I'm so much into this. And maybe I can point fingers sometimes at Protestants. And yeah, I'm not an apologetics kind of thing where you're, kind of maybe pulling them in. But here's a question I can maybe just throw it on Aaron. One of the ideas was that Catholics, because I think when Protestants watch a conversation like we're having, they think that we're all in our own heads and that there's no we're in Jesus and but privately we are. But I think that a lot of Protestants, when they watch a conversation like this, it's like, well, where's Jesus in all of this? Now, we're three people that were Protestants, and we came in. And one of the things that someone scolded me with was this idea. And she said, Doug, all you need is love. She didn't want to just say faith alone. So she said, faith and love, not knowledge. So I'm all maybe in my pride, my head and something like this, but I didn't take it personally because I've resigned all these things to the magisterium. I don't have to pick and poke and figure out what theology I'm going to have or my eschatology or my ecclesiology. I got it for me. So that's why Protestant Catholics aren't all when people are poking at us, because it's and that's why our priests don't have to get up there and bang a podium because they just resign themselves to the tradition. They don't have to be. And it's the most amazing thing. And it can express itself in kumbaya-ness and brotherly love and even putting a hand on somebody sometime. But I can't explain it. You guys have, I'm going to defer here to Aaron because he's been in the faith. He's seen Protestants. He's seen, I don't know if you ever went to any of these big mega deals in your life where the emotions really fly. But I mean, obviously none of this can compare when you're truly resign yourself to the beauty, the truth, and the goodness of a Latin mass, and you're really finally in a convocation with all time and all. That is so mind blowing that any, turning up the guitar to 11 can't get into. But okay, I'm getting kind of carried away, and I want to get back to Grant. And Grant, you can do this too. But do we get lost in our own head in these kind of like all philosophers, and we're talking about, we're not talking about canon law, but we're talking about Lefebvre and economy and politics. Why does this matter? Well, we know, I'll answer part of it. We know that God was really particular in the Old Testament about how he wanted to be worshiped. So we also want to return that to, there's a good way God wants to be worshiped. So we want to do it right by God. And he was, in the epistles, they're very particular about getting doctrine right. It's not just it's a buffet here. Y'all can kind of pick and choose. No, and that's why we are so particular about the treasure that's been handed down to us. And first of all, receiving it in our hearts and spirits, and then preserving it. But I've been talking too much. Aaron, I'm going to pick back up to you, and I'm going to try to shut down because I'm loving what you're saying, Grant.
I think one of the things I remember about being a Protestant, that was always this process of trying to find Jesus and trying to understand him and discover what it is that he wanted. And there's this constant reading of scripture, which is good. And going to preachers and trying to find guys that clicked with you. But this idea of finding Jesus was something very different than what you understand in the Catholic Church, because Jesus is found. Whenever you understand the Eucharist, nothing can compare in your day-to-day life with adoration, with going and receiving Christ in the Eucharist and spending that time in front of him, which is what is so unique about the Latin Mass, is that the Latin Mass allows you to enter into that prayer leading up to the Eucharist and reception. So there's such a disconnect between the Protestant paradigm and the Catholic paradigm of who Christ is, that it's very difficult to get to a place where you can have a conversation.
It's where Grant began the whole thing. It's incommensurate.
Yeah,
we're talking past each other to different paradigm. And I'm going to suggest, Aaron, one of the differences is we believe in a visible church.
Right.
They believe in an invisible church, and we believe in a visible church, that Christ left us a visible church. Through apostolic succession, when he breathed on the apostles, they consecrated. The Eucharist is a physical thing that represents a visible church. And
how do you define the invisible?
We prepare ourselves through sacrifice to prepare his sacrifice. Heaven and earth come together, and that's the visible church.
Yeah,
and
if you can't explain
you're saved through an invisible church, it's because Christ lives in the church through that unique presence. And it fits a totality, a holistic system, and everything out is whatever denomination you've got a lot of truths there, but you're missing the totalitarianism, the totality of it. And you can point right now, like, look at Francis, look at how crazy that is. Look at the scandals in the church. He promised us that his visible church will have weeds and tares, and the human element, it's been prophesied that it will eventually perhaps even be at the head of the church. But we maintain the divinity. Christ, we're communities of divinity within the visible church. And the graces that flow out to the whole world. So whoever's received. Now, I know it's not in a mindset like, well, thank you, Catholics, because Protestants give Catholics no props whatsoever. Everything is just, oh, you kind of got the nature of God right, fully man, fully, you got the Trinity right, we're going to take that, and other than that, you suck, and we're going to do our own thing on the dance floor. Okay, Grant, I'm going to get back to you. We got so far hopefully some of this kind of comes back to some of the things you were, but I don't know if you want to work back into the state system. I'll let you just return to wherever you want to go.
I'll try to do both at once, actually, because that's a great question, a great concept, and I think it relates to one of these presuppositions that Protestants and Catholics don't realize is there to discuss, and that is what is a human being and what influences us. And so in this, like, I think Locke articulates it very well, this idea that liberals have, that we're a blank slate and reason is prime. And reason, for I think people these days, replaces truth. And Professor Kaczynski had a great section on this in his book Modernity as Apocalypse, where he discussed the ability for logical axioms to work out when they're based on untrue information and deceive the person following them into thinking that the conclusion is true just because it's reasonable. Because there are things that are reasonable that are not true. And this is the idea that I think that people fall for. And then when Catholics have conversations with them, if someone were to say to me, all you need to do is believe in Jesus, I would say, on what authority do you say that? And that's not an answerable question, because if a person says, well, I looked at the Bible, and in, I think it's John 3, I think John 3:16 is that passage. But what does belief mean? What does that word mean? Because there are a bunch of things about what Jesus tells us to do. And he says, so-and-so will not enter the kingdom of heaven. All people who profess my name will not enter the kingdom of heaven. But I'm not even going to go to those questions with someone unless they can tell me what gives them the authority to interpret the Bible. Because if I
Grant, and I want to back up with the reason thing, because I think you put your finger on it and it gets lost. And you got to remember, during the French Revolution, first of all, a planned event by the cabal. And they knew the Trojan horse that would be most effective. And so what were they trotting, what are they kind of trotting around the city of Paris with a statue of reason? And that's what they were going to, because it puffs up your pride. We're so sophisticated, we're reasonable. And that's when they were changing in this punctuated moment. Jews good, Catholics bad, commerce good, stained glass bad. And so that was superstition. We're literate. So we can take all these things out of context and just read them there, separate from the totality of the magisterium and the way they were given to us. And it's so powerful just to realize that God wouldn't just lay this confusion onto the world. The Holy Spirit was present. Yes, there was some confusion around the first couple centuries with the fathers. They had the councils, they got the canon of scripture, and they built Christian civilization. By and large, I would argue, because of the Augustinian synthesis, which is we are the millennial age and we're in a period of waiting. And that's exactly the center of attack that the cabal had to get through the Protestant Revolution and then indoctrinated into these new commercially viable sects that now allowed usury and open the gates. And it was all dressed up in this idea that we're now reasonable and literate and can make more money. But Northern Europeans can now look down their nose at Southern Europeans and say, look at you with all that superstition and beads and stained glass and all the pomp and circumstance. And here's the critique you get from against Catholics today. It's either you're dumb and childlike because you believe in Mary and this kind of stuff, or you're all lost in your head. Which one is it? And don't you think that a church that would actually be a big net, it's there for everybody. A lot of people are going to fall, but the truth is there. Within the visible church, the truth is going to be there. And God, whatever church is kind of around to you, if he's calling you into that church, you'll find some people, he'll make sure the Blessed Mother will be leading the way, that you'll find some kind of sustainable community, at least for now, that if you're being called in, you'll be provided for. But I want you to get back to your story, Grant.
Sure. And that, I think that very idea is the place to, since people grow up now with radically different views of who God is and what Christianity is, it's hard to really start there. And I think that with the laws of logic, that you know that any reasonable person, of course, I'm using these words, but they're going to respect those rules before you begin a conversation. And I think that is really a place to start. And like like what Aaron said about the person who's equating life and death, that if someone says, no, I don't recognize the laws of logic, conversation over. You can't do anything. You got to just pray. You got to just pray for that person, because you can't. This is the self-deification, is that when a person takes on when they adopt to them the authority to define terms, and you play ball with them, you're playing ball with their terms. And so they get to define the words that you're trying to use in a different way, and you're allowing them to do that. And so, but that's the thing that's so hard about now. Everybody wants to get into a conversation. They want to get into a debate for the entertainment, not for the good of the other person. They just want to have the conversation feel right. Not saying everybody, not saying all the time, but I've definitely been there. And I know people go in and have the same conversation with the same person dozens of times about this tax policy or that, whatever, for that reason, just to play it out, just to play out the dialogue tree. But if someone is being honest and they're recognizing the laws of logic, identity specifically, identity, contradiction, excluded middle, you understand what I'm saying. And you point to this time period when Protestantism comes into existence. This is, you could argue that it goes back to the schism, but just for the sake of Western civilization in a shorter historical time period, confessional states occur at the Treaty of Westphalia in, 1648?
Yes.
And these state authorities say which version of Christianity is true in their states. Now that is the particularization of how this idea manifests. But the principle is that truth has at this point been discarded in terms of how we're going to go along with business as usual. Because the point that you made earlier about the order that we had prior to any sort of breakup wasn't that there weren't conflicts. There were conflicts. It wasn't perfect. People did bad things to each other. They sinned. We are sinners. That's a part of the deal. But they had an agreement on what reality was, metaphysical and physical reality. So you could have an Englishman saying, I hate that Frenchman, but the Englishman would not be denying what the Frenchman was. And we are now at a point where those aren't terms that we can define anymore, because at this moment, Western Europe surrendered the concept of truth for business as usual. And truth questions were usurped by the state authority, where I don't care if you're a Catholic. I'm not, right now, me saying this right now, I'm not saying whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant, it doesn't matter. You know that multiple states are operating in error. But it appears as though everything is fine. And truth questions are not absolute anymore. We do not relate to the truth as the governing authority. We are relating these things to the power structure. And that's what the will to power is, where there is no truth, there is only power. It's that the power structure, it doesn't actually have the authority to define terms, but it exercises the power to define terms because we have allowed it to.
Right. Yeah. And we said this yesterday. Well, I said it yesterday. We happened to stumble on it with when I was speaking to the Catholic Esquire. We talked about it in our conversation. So unhooked from the perfection of that reality, which is the integral order, where nations, borders, and language, borders, language, and culture were all preserved within an order properly. But the ecclesial order was over the monarchical order. When that became decoupled or unhinged, for example, with the British Revolution, and the order got inverted, one of the results that we can see is we have this absolute monarchy, and that's what that's what absolute power does. And he went berserk, and he was totalitarian, and the American Revolution had good grounds for doing that. Unhooked from the proper anthropology and order and ecclesiology of and they might have had a decent theology, unhooked from the divine order, that's what you get. Now, that didn't mean they weren't able to make an empire, but it was an empire of man, as opposed, and it's a product of the city of man, and its destiny would be such. It's not that people weren't saved along the way. That's not it. But we as Catholics understand there's the city of man and the city of God. They inverted that order with the British Revolution from the city of God, the city of man, to Protestants are always right and the Catholics are the enemies. And somehow the commanding heights of the synagogue were okay to ignore as long as we were all, because we must be right because we're now an empire. Yes, you're an empire of man. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's totally fine. And that idea is, I think, speaks to the original set of verses that I cited, which is that
about wisdom.
We now, when the only way that people operate or think they operate in American politics is by every 2 or 4 years going and casting a vote. So people think of politics purely in terms of power. They don't think of it in terms of responsibility. They don't think of any devotion that they owe to people. You actually talked about this, and I can't remember what show, but it was about the Roman citizens when they were kind of identifying with the church, and that their citizenship was a part of their being. It wasn't just doing
wow, that must have been years ago. I haven't said that in years, but yeah, they participated with their being in 25 years in the military. And it had that authenticity. And we're supposed to go down and say, well, I can't vote for Sleepy Joe. And we don't grasp what's lost because we're meant to give our being to the fullness of the blockchain of being. I'm getting off a little bit.
Right. No, but that's what we think of those things as. We don't think of the responsibility that we take on through the exercise of power. And so it wasn't like, I think of Protestantism and liberalism as spiritual and secular versions of the same thing. It is just the adoption of the choice and putting
exactly.
choice prior to life. When one of the reasons why life and being supersedes choice is because all choice is dependent on existence. You
yes.
cannot make choices if you do not first exist. So it's not just that it's higher, it's prior to it. And with this idea of power, you have the church. I can't remember exactly what was going on leading up to this time, but members of the church scandalizing people to the point that people were saying, and there are a lot of factors that went into it. I can't remember. There's a great book it's called How the Reformation Happened by Hilaire Belloc. It's a great book. But there were some things that were going on in the church that made people go, this can't be the institution that I'm supposed to be a part of, because they wouldn't be doing this if they were not on this behavior. So we're just going to break off and start our own church. And that is basically what the devolution is people not fulfilling their responsibilities as leaders and leading their subordinates to want to rebel against them, which doesn't mean that they shouldn't rebel against them. But when someone looks up and they go, hey, Dad, why are you treating me this way? And then they have father issues and you wonder why. It's like, yeah, you do owe loyalty to your father. You do owe loyalty to your priest. You do owe loyalty to your bishop. You do owe this continuum of loyalty upward. And those are stratified layers of progressively larger hierarchies that are meant to protect us from all of these different things that we're now totally exposed to as atomized individuals. But this process has been the progressive deconstruction of trust in the Father, where it's in the human case, it's not it is the fault of the people who scandalize people and make them rebel, but that doesn't make the rebellion correct. But that's the progression. It's from the tricky version of it's I get to interpret the Bible, and a person doesn't think that they're asserting their own will into their interpretation. They think that they're using an external authority,
exactly.
a Bible.
but they're not. They're using their own mind and what they want to see in it when they need to move something, when something needs to change. And that in itself is even a lie, because that's really the product of whatever temptation is pulling the strings behind them. And
Right.
they don't know that that's going on.
Yeah, it's not only a, kind of just inculcated into this sort of Lockean blank slate. When I even teach about the court system, judges say, especially in a place like Texas, judges are actually elected. But yes, we all bring predispositions, loyalties, ideologies, we all bring this in to interpretation. It's just the nature of being. When we somehow, I'm trying to put it in simple terms, when we resign ourselves to something like I call it the blockchain of being, it would be the centerpiece of it is Christ the King. We resign ourselves in the city of God and we rest. And that's what the millennial kingdom's about. We rest. That doesn't mean we do nothing, but it's a spiritual point of rest because it's been always finished on the cross. Anything necessary for salvation, we rest in that moment spiritually. When we get pulled away from that completion, we become a part of a project of becoming, because somehow that it couldn't have been completed somehow. We're teased into this idea of different Jesuses. And the worst, dereliction of this is some kind of the Jews have to build a temple before something. I mean, you literally, like, what Bible are you reading? I mean, goodness gracious. But yes, right. Beyond this hermeneutics, we're always becoming, and the whole American system, we're always becoming. Consumerism, we're always becoming. And that's what the detachment's about. Are you with me, Aaron? That's what the detachment is about, to kind of find that place of rest. And it's not like we're going to try to reinvent Christendom. It's that it's a place that we can understand that the city of man has been perfected, and that all of our pursuits are really just turning us over and over and over again. And again, everybody's going to get back, and I'll let you do this, Grant. So so I find this out, and the synagogues behind it, and they're building a new world order. And let me just where we're at an hour and 26 minutes at this point. I'm watching all these people I'm getting off topic here, about becoming, if you want to bring me back to it. We're always becoming. We're always becoming. Everything's about, we're fed this all the time. And again, I think the traditional Latin Mass is the best microcosm of that world that we can come and experience that experience of being. This week, everybody's doing the rounds. It's not Michael Voris, whatever's going on and it's a good question. What are we going to do, if the hammer comes down on the traditional Mass? So we'll ask this priest and this talking head and like, who's behind it? Everybody said. And again, nobody wants to name a name. It's that simple. They want to crush it. So they're crushing Christ and the way he wants to be worshipped. So they can make their messianic kingdom. But you cannot find that out here. You have to come to the dark corners of YouTube and I'm just going to say what I think the best priest in the 20th century said exactly that. Name names. And if we can get back, because they were also trying to bring us back to that context of being within the city of God. I talked too much there. Aaron, do you want to jump back in, or do we should go straight to Grant?
I was going to say something that goes back to what Grant was saying with regards to, both of you were talking about when you look at these kingdoms that, like with England and everything, creating all this confusion whenever they did their revolt, and then this era that led up to the Reformation or the other revolt. I think one of the things that we've got to take into account now in our time is that we've been here before, not quite like this, because now we're looking at heresy at the highest levels. So there's a lot more confusion with what's going on, but it doesn't change the fact that we still have tradition that we can go back to. But when you've got an abusive father, which we have, and we're still in that place that we may not be able to reap the benefits of our prayers and sacrifices. We may be in a position where we, through this discernment process, everybody's going to kind of be on their own. It's going to be a Wild West for a while until the dust settles, especially if they do eliminate the Latin Mass for the majority of people. So there's going to be a desert out there. But in the end, this suffering that we take on
Yes.
as we go through this has purpose because God has allowed it. He has not stopped the Novus Ordo. The Blessed Virgin has come during the time of the Novus Ordo and Our Lady of Akita. We've had Eucharistic miracles within the Novus Ordo, not one within the SSPX or any of the. So we've been confirmed in our faith, but there's an element of obedience that, like, because God wants that. God wants obedience. That's one of the things that's missed in the whole Protestant experiment, is that there's no aspect of obedience other than to what you yourself determine is what you're going to abide by.
Yeah.
So there's this suffering that I think we have to be willing to go into, the spiritual desert, the spiritual dryness that we have to be prepared to take on. With all of the questions about going into parishes where there's communion in hand, and the possibilities of particles on the floor, and all of these serious questions that people are asking, but in the end, there's just a level of suffering that we need to come to terms with right now, today, and be willing to open our hearts to what God's going to tell us all the same thing with regards to this. It's always going to be going back to an understanding of tradition and understanding what's been handed down. And then when you walk into that parish and you've been broken up, and everything that you held dear before is now been destroyed or severely damaged, you're gonna have to take it on, and it's going to be tough. And I think, last thought on that is that this is why right now in these last moments that we have, maybe middle of July does come about, this fear that we're all worried about. But right now, today, and until that happens, you have to be putting a lot of your effort into securing your network, because you don't want to find yourself alone and unafraid on the battlefield.
Yeah, I've heard, I tuned in this week and listened to the conversations, and I think what you just said is what people are really looking for deep down. They're looking for what you just said. That didn't come from your head. It's just like, it's part of God's plan. You roll with it, and it's a reminder that, the TLM can become an idol.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll let you go. I'll let you continue where you were, Grant.
There's something that I would like to add to that I think I can tie into a continuation, which is hearkening to what Aaron said. I think about the time that I was very, very interested in the physical aspect of overcoming the state of the modern West, and it was just all exercise. And there was a big trend, I don't know if you guys heard of it, but it was called post physique on Fridays, where people would literally take like a picture and post it online of what their build was. Basically, you're a representation of your beliefs and your willingness to suffer and go through pain and asceticism for the sake of aesthetics. And I kind of thought of that as you should image the type of church that you would like to see, and one that is the ultimate, the expression of the ultimate potential of what you can be. But coming into the church was a humbling experience for me when I recognized that I had to pray for an understanding of why the exertion of power wasn't all that I thought that it was, because I knew that wasn't what Christ did while he was here, and that he was talking about peace and charity and love. And first of all, love being willing the good of the other, not just really liking someone or letting someone do what they want. That's another way that these definitions are turned around, where a person could say, oh, the church hates me because of a certain lifestyle choice, when they define those terms as the willingness to affirm and go along with something that someone wants to do or not, because it's all intermixed with these definitions of freedom. But anyway, if a 5-year-old called me
a poopy head, I would not respond to that. And I think that that is one of the ways that Christ expressed his divinity, in that he didn't need to be a 1,000-foot general or a giant, strong, like just a monstrous human being, just a big person, because that's a very human conception of divinity and power. And what he gave us was a transcendent image of divinity and power, where he is so beyond us that he doesn't need to show off in terms that we would find impressive.
He's beyond categories. He's beyond a category that we can create. And that's why we meditate with the rosary on those moments when Christ would be beyond something a category that we even have. And he displays it through that for us specifically, so we can have for Protestants, a personal relationship with Christ.
Right. And that moment culminates in when he is with Pilate before his crucifixion, and the crowds are yelling up at them. And if you look in the Gospels, Jesus does not say anything to the crowds. He talks to Pilate in the book of John, and I think that in the other Gospels, Pilate says to him, "Are you a king?" And he says, "You say that I am a king." But in John, he talks to him a little bit more. But Jesus, who is powerless in the hands of Pilate, is listening to these crowds yelling up at him, and he says nothing to them. Pilate is the power. He's Rome. He has all of this in his hands, but he's looking down at the people, and he's thinking about his position, and he's talking to them. And he knows that Jesus hasn't done anything wrong. It says that in all of them, that he's aware that they brought Jesus to him out of jealousy. But he eventually gives in to what they're saying because of his fear of the threat that they pose to his power. And that is the ultimate, I think the way that the Ouroboros applies to the will to power is that you are, as the master dictating truth in quotes to everyone else, you are above and superior to these people that you rely on for the legitimacy of your power. And it's just it's a self-consumptive circle where you have Pilate in this expression of Roman power giving in to these people who they've brought Jesus to him to execute him when he's not a revolutionary. And they hand back over to the people a revolutionary because they're afraid of these people who are threatening his position. And so all of that is to say, sorry, you can go ahead.
No, I want you to finish.
Okay. All that is to say that in this time that we're in, it is very tempting to just continue to harp on the things that are going on. I know that I want to, but when I was leaving the mission organization that I worked for, the CEO was talking about a story from St. Catherine of Siena and her dialogue with I don't remember if it was Jesus or the Father. I wasn't clear on that, but she's talking to God, and he says, "I want you to love me gratuitously, but you can't, because you love me out of an obligation that you have. Whether you cannot love me gratuitously without merit, because I do merit your love. But that is why you have your neighbors, so that you can love them the way that I love you, because I love you gratuitously." And I don't care if anyone here or watching this is 10 times or 100 times holier than someone that they know or someone else in their life, whatever. If you're a 0.03001 and the other person is a 0.3201, negative zeros, you're a 0.0000001 and they are two more zeros than you are both still infinitely closer to zero than you are to one. And that is the kind of charity that I think that we are supposed to express in this time, where we've been born into the time that we have been. And I ask myself the question, would I rather my ancestors or my descendants face this time? Neither of them. I would rather face it. But I face that by conforming to the church that God handed down to me. Because the truth, it's really not too complex for people to want. It's actually too simple for people to want. It's a lot easier.
Yeah. I tell you what, everybody, we're going to kick it over to locals and wind this down. But what I want to do is connect what Aaron just said about the times we're in, because I think the Spirit moved through him when he said that. And I want to kick what Grant just said, because I think something important happened between which you guys were dialoguing with. And you hit upon it, Grant, when you mentioned the moment of silence with Christ, which was prophesied in Isaiah 53. And think about that. That would be a prophecy from before the creation of anything, that Christ was already going to be there. The Blessed Mother's role in all of this would be there. And that moment of silence that was prophesied was going to be there. You know, the synagogue removes that entirely. Catholic Answers even had a show introducing how the synagogue interprets Isaiah 51. But here's where I'm going right now with this confusion. And with what you said, Aaron, how we have to kind of keep this in mind, that this is, whether it's part of a chastisement, we don't understand. There's a certain mystery. But I think that something that's hitting me is we have to have a type of silence. It's pulling us back to the being, the fullness of being, and the idea that we don't exactly understand what's going on right now. And we have to be like Christ in this moment that I think typologically is occurring right now. We have to have a type of withdrawal and silence, if that makes any sense. A little bit. Okay, y'all. We're gonna end this over here. We're gonna move over to locals. If we have any trouble transferring over there in the next few minutes, we will be downloading later. So for this segment, for some people that will only be able to watch this part, I hope you enjoyed everything Grant was saying. You've been one of my favorite guests so far, Grant. This has been fabulous. But there's some more, and we want to wind it down, but we're going to say good night to everybody. I'm going to be back tomorrow. I have a guest. He's from our locals community, and we're going to be talking about his journey, and we're going to be doing that over on locals. So everybody, for now,